In the stillness of the late night, inside a quiet suburban home in Ohio, a shadowy figure moved silently through the dimly lit kitchen. The soft glow from the refrigerator cast an eerie light onto her sharp, calculating features. Her hands trembled slightly as she reached for a mysterious bottle of pills, but she had no idea. Someone else was watching. Not a person, but Max, a German shepherd with an uncanny instinct for sensing danger. A low growl rumbled in his throat, his fur bristling as an unsettling feeling crept over him. But who could have guessed that his relentless barking would be the key to unraveling a dark, chilling conspiracy? Could a single dog save an entire family from the clutches of a sinister deceiver? Join us as we uncover this gripping story on Hidden Stories Now, and don't forget to share your thoughts in the comments below. Ryan Turner, the only son of the Turner family, was preparing for the biggest day of his life, his wedding to Emily, a stunning woman from New York. The ceremony was set to take place at a sprawling estate just outside Cincinnati. Family and close friends had already gathered to celebrate, but not everyone was eagerly awaiting this moment. Under the shade of an ancient oak tree, Max lay low on the grass. His ears perked. His breathing grew heavier than usual. His sharp eyes were locked onto something unseen, something only he could sense. Mrs. Turner, dressed in an elegant navy blue gown, happened to pass by and paused, noticing Max's strange behavior. She furrowed her brows, kneeling down to stroke his head. "Max, what's wrong, sweetheart? Today is a happy day." But instead of his usual wagging tail, Max remained still, his gaze fixed on the entrance gate, his muscles tensed. The fur along his spine stood rigid, as if he were bracing for a fight. Then the sound of an approaching car shattered the silence. A sleek limousine glided smoothly over the gravel driveway, coming to a stop at the main entrance. The atmosphere shifted, turning eerily still. Guests rose to their feet, anticipation thick in the air as they awaited the bride's arrival. The car door opened and Emily stepped out. That very moment, Max lost it. His bark thundered through the air like a crack of lightning, tearing apart the once celebratory mood. He lunged forward with such force that Mrs. Turner nearly toppled over. His eyes burned with a fierce primal fury. This wasn't just caution. This was rage. The wedding went off without a hitch. At least that's what everyone believed. But within weeks, the atmosphere in the Turner household began to shift in an inexplicable way. The warmth, the laughter, the cozy family dinners that once filled the house all seemed to evaporate into thin air. And the most noticeable change was in Ryan. Once a man full of energy, Ryan used to wake up at the crack of dawn to jog with Max before helping his father tend to the garden or sharing a cup of freshly brewed coffee with his mother. Now he barely got out of bed before noon, and even when he did, he looked like a man who had just battled a week-long fever, hollowed eyes, pale skin, his voice sluggish, as if his consciousness was drifting somewhere far, far away. Mrs. Turner grew concerned. "Ryan, are you sure you're okay?" One morning, she gently placed a hand on his forehead, only to feel an unsettling coolness. Ryan forced a smile, but even he didn't seem convinced by his own reassurance. "I'm just adjusting to married life, Mom. I'll be fine." But Mrs. Turner wasn't so easily convinced. For the first time in her life, she saw her son drained of his very essence. And Max felt it too. The loyal dog no longer bounded through the house with his usual energy. He ate his meals, sure, but something was keeping him on edge. Every night, he stationed himself outside Ryan and Emily's bedroom door, eyes wide open, fur bristling, as if standing guard against an unseen intruder. Then one night, the scratching began. At first, Mrs. Turner thought it was just Max being restless, but then it happened every night. At precisely 2:15 a.m., Max would start scratching at Ryan and Emily's door, growling in low, menacing tones that sent shivers down her spine. One night, she decided to investigate. The house was shrouded in darkness, save for the dim glow of a hallway nightlight casting long, eerie shadows. She moved carefully, her footsteps barely making a sound. Max was already there, sitting stiffly in front of Ryan's door. His eyes reflected the faint light, glowing an unnatural cold gold. He didn't bark. He didn't move. He just stared at the closed door, as if he knew something dangerous lurked behind it. Max, what is it? She whispered. But just as she stepped closer, the door swung open. Emily stood there. In the dim light, her face looked eerily pale, as if the glow refused to touch her skin. Her long, wavy hair cascaded over her bony shoulders. In her hand was a small brown bottle. A chill ran down Mrs. Turner's spine. Still up, Mother? Emily's voice was soft, too soft. It was smooth, measured, almost rehearsed. Mrs. Turner didn't answer right away. Her gaze locked onto the bottle in Emily's hand. What are you doing? Her voice was low, sharp. Emily tilted her head slightly before flashing a delicate, almost chillingly gentle smile. Oh, just some sleeping pills. Ryan's been having trouble sleeping lately. I just want to help him rest better. At that moment, Max let out a deep, guttural growl. Louder this time, more urgent, as if he was desperately trying to warn her. Mrs. Turner didn't look away. If they're just sleeping pills, why not give them to him during the day? For the briefest second, she saw it. Emily's eyes flickered, a moment of hesitation, a flash of irritation, but it was gone as quickly as it came, replaced by another practiced smile. Because he only needs to sleep at night, Mother. Too much rest during the day wouldn't be good for him, would it? Mrs. Turner said nothing. In all her 50-plus years of life, she had never felt this kind of unease. There was something she knew for certain. When people lie, the scariest part isn't what they say, it's how they say it. And Emily lied flawlessly. Mrs. Turner couldn't sleep, even after retreating to her bedroom, shutting her eyes, forcing herself to rest. Her heart pounded relentlessly, her mind replaying every second of her encounter with Emily. The expression on her face, the unnatural smoothness of her voice, the presence of that bottle in the dead of night. Something was terribly wrong. She remembered when Ryan was a little boy. He once had a neighbor friend, Tommy. One summer, Tommy had broken a window while playing, but when questioned, he smiled, blinked innocently, and lied effortlessly about not being involved. But Mrs. Turner saw it, that fleeting moment of concealment in his eyes. And Emily? She had the same look. But this wasn't a child lying about a broken window. Emily was a grown woman. And what kind of secret could a woman like her be hiding? One thing was certain. Mrs. Turner had to act, and she had to act tonight. She sat up, slipping on a thin robe, moving silently out of her room. The house was eerily still. The ticking of the clock echoed through the halls like a reminder that time was running out. Max remained crouched outside Ryan's door, his golden eyes gleaming in the dark, as if waiting. Mrs. Turner knelt beside him, stroking his head. I know, Max, she whispered. I feel it too. The dog licked her hand softly, an unspoken agreement. She straightened, moving down the hallway to Emily and Ryan's bedroom door. Her fingers hovered over the doorknob. She wasn't surprised to find it locked. A person with nothing to hide wouldn't keep their door shut so tightly. But Mrs. Turner had an advantage. When Emily moved in, she had kept a spare key, not because she didn't trust her daughter-in-law, but because she believed in protecting her home. And now, that precaution was paying off. With a soft click, the door unlocked. Inside, the room was cloaked in darkness, save for the silver glow of the moon filtering through the curtains, illuminating familiar furnishings. The bed, the wardrobe, Emily's dressing table. But Mrs. Turner wasn't looking for what was in plain sight. She was looking for what had been hidden. She moved quietly to the wardrobe. Emily's dresses hung neatly, arranged with careful precision. But that wasn't what caught her attention. It was the small wooden box, tucked at the very bottom, concealed beneath a thick winter coat, a box that wasn't supposed to be there. Her pulse quickened. Carefully, she reached down, and just as her fingers brushed against the lid, a voice came from behind her. What are you doing, Mother? Mrs. Turner's hands trembled as she gently pulled the wooden box from the bottom of the wardrobe. Her breath hitched as she lifted the lid. Inside, a collection of photographs lay stacked neatly. At first, they seemed ordinary. Pictures of Ryan, shots of him and Emily when they first met, snapshots from vacations, glimpses of their life together. But then, she saw one that made her chest tighten. It was a picture of Emily, but it wasn't taken in New York. She was standing outside a strange house, posing beside a middle-aged couple. They all looked so happy, smiling warmly for the camera. But something was wrong. The couple's faces. They looked familiar. Mrs. Turner flipped through the other photos, her pulse quickening. One showed Emily standing alone in front of a large estate. Another had her sitting on a plush sofa beside a woman with graying hair. And then she found it, a photo of the same couple. But this time it wasn't just a photograph. It had been cut out from an old newspaper article. Her eyes locked onto the headline. The mysterious disappearance of the Pearson family vanished without a trace. Mrs. Turner's breath caught in her throat. The Pearsons. She remembered now. A few years ago, their disappearance had made national headlines. A wealthy couple, owners of one of New York's largest financial firms, had simply vanished. No forced entry, no ransom demand, no evidence of a struggle. They had just ceased to exist. And now Emily had photos with them? Why? A chill crawled down her spine. She glanced at her hands and realized they were shaking. Had Emily been involved in their disappearance? If so, how and why? Before she could process another thought, a sound broke the silence. A small noise from the hallway. She froze. Someone was outside the door. The dim bedroom light cast a glow into the hallway, enough for her to see it. A shadow, standing, listening. Emily. Mrs. Turner quickly shut the box, sliding it back into place. But it was too late. The door creaked open. Emily stood there, draped in a silk white robe, her dark hair falling loosely around her shoulders. And in her hand, the same small brown bottle. Her eyes dark, unreadable. Her voice smooth as glass. "What are you doing, Mother?" The door slowly creaked open, and Emily appeared. She stood there wrapped in a silk white robe, her dark hair cascading over her shoulders. Her eyes silent but sharp, like a blade hidden beneath velvet. In her hand she still held the small brown bottle, a silent warning of what was to come. Mrs. Turner didn't move. She could feel her heartbeat slowing, her blood pulsing through her veins in a steady, controlled rhythm. She had encountered liars, manipulators, and deceivers in her lifetime, but never had she felt threatened like this. "What are you doing, Mother?" Emily's voice was soft, too soft. There was a precision to it, a cold calculation hidden beneath its gentle cadence. Mrs. Turner met her gaze head-on. "That's a question you should be asking yourself, Emily." Her voice was low but as sharp as a freshly whetted blade. Emily didn't blink. She tilted her head slightly, her lips pressing into a thin line. "You think I'm hiding something?" Mrs. Turner didn't flinch. "Not just something, Emily. A whole plan." The air between them thickened, turning almost suffocating. From the doorway, Max growled. His fur bristled, muscles tensed, as if he could feel the unspoken battle unraveling between the two women. Emily stepped inside and gently closed the door behind her. The soft click of the latch felt like the sealing of a trap. "You've been going through my things." She moved forward, not like a woman scorned, but like a predator closing in on its prey. Not rummaging, searching for answers. Mrs. Turner stood firm, her eyes never wavering. Emily's lips curled into a faint smile, a cold, detached expression. "And did you find them?" Mrs. Turner's fingers clenched into a fist. "The photo, you and the Pearson family." A single blink from Emily, but no fear. If anything, a flicker of amusement. "Ah," she exhaled softly, as if Mrs. Turner had just solved a riddle. "So, you've read the news?" A quiet chuckle. "They disappeared, Emily." Without a trace, Mrs. Turner's voice was ice cold. "And you, somehow, have a picture with them. What did you do to them?" Silence. Then Emily sat down. She crossed her legs gracefully, the bottle of pills still rolling lightly between her fingers. "You are fascinating, Mother." She swirled the liquid inside the bottle, watching it form slow, deliberate spirals. Mrs. Turner's voice did not waver. "You still haven't answered my question." Emily exhaled through her nose, then smiled. But this time, the facade was gone. "Who do you think I am?" she asked, voice laced with mocking curiosity. Mrs. Turner didn't hesitate. A liar. Emily's smile widened. Oh, Mother, you're wrong. She leaned forward, her dark eyes gleaming. I'm not just a liar. I'm the one who controls everything. A chill crawled down Mrs. Turner's spine. She wasn't even trying to deny it. She was proud. Does Ryan know who you really are? Emily let out a soft, amused laugh. Ryan? She raised an eyebrow, shaking her head slightly. Ryan knows nothing. And do you know why? Mrs. Turner tightened her jaw but remained silent. Emily leaned back, drawing out the moment. Because he trusts me. Her voice was honeyed. The same way you did, at least for the first few months. Mrs. Turner's patience snapped. What have you done to him? Emily tilted her head, her gaze unsettlingly bright. Nothing, really. She hummed lightly. Just, made things easier for him. Less worry, less doubt. And most importantly, she let the words hang in the air before whispering, more control. Mrs. Turner felt her blood turn to ice. She had suspected it, but hearing Emily say it aloud ignited a fire inside her. You've been poisoning him. Emily let out a small exhale of amusement. Oh, Mother, you make it sound so dramatic. She stood up and took a slow step forward. It's just a little something. Did you know that, when properly dosed, a person can slowly lose their clarity without even realizing it? Mrs. Turner's fingers twitched with rage. Ryan is not your puppet. Emily's lips barely parted as she whispered, Oh, but he already is. A deep, feral growl erupted from Max. Emily turned sharply, and for the first time something flickered in her expression. Irritation. Mrs. Turner saw it. You can control Ryan, but you can't control Max, can you? Emily's face hardened. Mrs. Turner pressed on. He's known from the beginning. He's seen what the rest of us missed. A loyal dog can't be manipulated. Emily's jaw clenched. You're smarter than I thought, Mother. Mrs. Turner took a deep, slow breath. This ends tonight. Emily's lips curved into a smirk. And what exactly do you plan to do? She cocked her head slightly. Call the police? Do you really think they'll believe you? Mrs. Turner smiled. No. She slowly reached into her robe pocket and pulled out a small recording device. The screen glowed faintly. The recording app was still running. Emily's face finally changed, a flicker of genuine panic. Mrs. Turner held the device up, her voice sharp. You're not the first liar I've dealt with, Emily. Her eyes gleamed like steel. And I know exactly how to take down someone like you. For a moment, they just stood there. Two women, no weapons, no physical attack, just a battle of willpower, a predator and a survivor. The room was suffocatingly silent. Mrs. Turner stood tall, gripping the recording device tightly, while Emily faced her, eyes sharp, dark, a predator backed into a corner. Everything had shifted. For the first time, Emily wasn't in control, but Mrs. Turner knew. A woman like Emily never surrendered easily. Emily blinked once, then again. And then she laughed, a low, dry, dangerous sound. You think you've won? Her voice was soft, but sharp as a razor. Mrs. Turner didn't respond. Do you really believe the police will take a recording that you obtained by sneaking into your daughter-in-law's room as evidence? A psychological strike. Mrs. Turner knew manipulators like Emily always played the victim when backed into a corner. They won't care how I got it. They'll only care about what's on it. Her voice was steady, unshaken. Emily's eyes narrowed. Her lips pressed into a thin line. You underestimate me, Mother. Her voice dropped lower. I always have a backup plan. From the corner of the room, Max growled. Then Emily lunged, fast like a striking snake. Her hand darted straight for the device. But Mrs. Turner was ready. She twisted away, pivoting, but not fast enough. Emily's nails dug into her wrist, clawing, wrenching at the device. Her grip was stronger than expected. A snap. The phone slipped, crashing to the floor. Emily dove, but before she could grab it, Max attacked. With a ferocious snarl, his powerful jaws clamped onto her arm. Emily let out a piercing scream, jerking back, clutching her bleeding wrist. Mrs. Turner seized the moment. She snatched up the phone, stepping quickly toward the door. Emily's face had gone pale with pain, but the fight wasn't over. Her breathing was ragged, her eyes wild with fury. "You don't understand what you're doing, Mother Turner." Her voice was unsteady but still dripping with venom. "If you hand that to the police, you'll destroy everything." Mrs. Turner's grip tightened. Destroy what? Emily's cold smile returned, despite the blood dripping from her fingertips. "Not just me." She licked her lips. "Ryan." Mrs. Turner's chest tightened. "What are you talking about?" Emily leaned against the wall, her body weak, but her eyes still dangerous. "Do you really think Ryan will be okay?" She whispered. "When he realizes that everything, his life, his marriage, was a lie? He'll survive it." "Are you sure?" Emily's smile turned sharp. "When a man realizes that everything he believed in was an illusion, do you think he can ever truly recover?" The words hit hard, like a knife slicing deep. Ryan had always trusted, always loved. What would happen when that trust was shattered? He may never be the same again. A flicker of hesitation. Emily saw it, seized it, and then she lunged again. But this time, not for the phone. For Mrs. Turner herself. A hard shove. But Max was faster. A deafening snarl. The dog lunged, slamming Emily to the floor. A heavy thud echoed through the room. Then, blinding headlights flooded the window. A split second later, police sirens split the night. Emily froze. Her head snapped toward the window. Her expression, pure disbelief. The police were here. Mrs. Turner, still catching her breath, stared down at the woman on the floor. "It's over, Emily." Emily turned her gaze back to her and smiled. A twisted, crooked smile. "You think so?" The door burst open. Two officers stormed in, guns raised. "Emily Lee, you're under arrest for fraud, attempted poisoning, and involvement in an unsolved disappearance." Another officer stepped forward, helping Mrs. Turner to her feet. She pointed toward Emily. "She manipulated my son. She had a plan. Searched the entire room." Even as she was restrained, Emily's eerie smirk never faded. "I told you, Mother Turner." Her voice was a whisper. "We're not finished." Mrs. Turner didn't reply. She simply stared down at her, knowing that this wasn't truly the end. But tonight, at least for tonight, justice had won. The Turner house, once filled with warmth and laughter, now sat in heavy silence. Mrs. Turner sat on the sofa, her hands still faintly trembling from everything that had happened. At her feet, Max lay watchful, his ears perked, his body tense, as if he knew the nightmare wasn't over. Then the front door opened. Ryan stepped inside. His movements were slow, exhausted, his face hollow, his eyes empty. The doctors had finally discharged him after a detoxification treatment. They said he would recover, but it would take time before his mind was fully his own again. He looked at his mother, then his gaze swept across the quiet house. "Where is she?" Mrs. Turner felt a sharp pain in her chest. She had prepared for this moment, but no amount of preparation could have made this any easier. "Ryan, sit down." He didn't move. "Mom, where is she?" Mrs. Turner took a deep breath, keeping her voice calm. "Emily has been arrested. The police have all the evidence they need to prove what she did to you." Ryan didn't react at first, but then his fist clenched. "You said evidence?" His voice was raw, hoarse, as if he barely believed his own words. Mrs. Turner nodded. "You were poisoned, Ryan. She was drugging you. A mind-altering substance that made you dependent, that stripped away your will, that turned you into someone who existed only to obey her." Ryan laughed, a dry, broken, bitter sound. He sank onto the couch, burying his face in his hands. "No, no, no," he whispered, his breath shaking. "You know how you felt, don't you?" Mrs. Turner's voice was gentle but unwavering. "You weren't yourself. You changed. And now you finally know why." Ryan shook his head. Cold sweat slid down his forehead. "She loved me," he murmured. Mrs. Turner's hands tightened. "That wasn't love, Ryan." Slowly, Ryan lifted his head. His bloodshot eyes stared at his mother, desperate. "Then what was it?" Mrs. Turner inhaled deeply. "Control." Her voice was firm. "Manipulation. A calculated plan to turn you into a puppet. Ryan stared at her, struggling to process the truth. Then, his voice cracked. But why? Why? That was the question Mrs. Turner had asked herself 100 times, and now she finally had an answer. Because she didn't love you, Ryan. She loved power. She loved the feeling of bending someone to her will. Silence. A long, heavy, unbearable silence. Outside, the sun dipped below the horizon, and darkness settled over the Turner house. At Ryan's feet, Max whined softly. The dog nudged Ryan's leg, sensing his pain. Ryan reached down, running his fingers through Max's fur. His voice was barely a whisper. You knew, didn't you? Max didn't bark, but in the shadows his golden eyes gleamed, the eyes of something that had never been deceived. Ryan let out another laugh, one laced with quiet devastation. Time blurred into something meaningless. Ryan barely spoke. He spent hours on the porch staring into the distance, lost. He had lost everything, not just a wife. He had lost himself. Memories played in his head, meals he didn't remember the taste of, conversations he couldn't recall, moments he thought were love, but were only manipulation. From a distance, Mrs. Turner watched her son with a heavy heart. She knew he wouldn't heal overnight. One afternoon, she made a cup of coffee and quietly placed it in front of him. Ryan looked up. His eyes were dark with exhaustion. Do you think I'll ever be okay? Mrs. Turner didn't answer right away. She simply rested a gentle hand on his shoulder. No one gets through something like this easily, Ryan. But you're my son, and I believe you'll find yourself again. Ryan sat still for a long time. Then, he reached for the coffee, lifted it to his lips, and took a sip. For the first time in months, he tasted it, not dull, not distant, real. That night, as Mrs. Turner was preparing for bed, the doorbell rang. Her brow furrowed. Who would come at this hour? She walked cautiously through the hallway, peering through the window. No one was there, but on the porch, a letter lay on the ground. Her hands trembled as she picked it up. No return address, no postmark, only a single handwritten line on the front. For Mrs. Turner. A chill crawled down her spine. She took a deep breath and opened the envelope. Inside, there was only one small piece of paper. The handwriting was uneven, rushed, but every word was crystal clear. You think you've won? We're far from finished. Mrs. Turner's heart stopped. Slowly, she lifted her eyes to the darkness beyond her porch. The wind howled through the trees, rustling the leaves like a whisper in the night. She turned, stepping back into the house, and locked the door. At her side, Max stood stiff. His ears twitched, his gaze fixed on the door. Like he knew, something was still coming. The Turner house stood still, wrapped in a heavy silence. Mrs. Turner's eyes remained locked on the paper in her hands, the scrawled words burning into her mind. You think you've won? We're far from finished. A cold wind whistled through the cracks of the door, rustling the curtains. At her side, Max let out a low growl, ears pinned back, his stance rigid, as if he sensed something still lurking in the shadows. Mrs. Turner looked out the window, scanning the darkened street. No one was there, but she felt it. Someone had been here. The next morning, Ryan sat on the porch, staring at nothing. One hand gripped a cup of cold coffee, the other idly stroking Max's fur. The dark circles beneath his eyes were still deep, but for the first time there was something else. Awareness. He was coming back to himself. Mrs. Turner approached, holding the note from the night before. Ryan, you need to see this. He looked up, his expression still weary. She handed him the paper. Ryan's jaw tightened as he read. His fingers curled into a fist. Who sent this? His voice was low, sharp. We don't know, she exhaled. It was left at the front door late last night. Ryan ground his teeth, then slowly stood. She still has people outside. It's possible. Number, not possible. Certain. His gaze darkened. Emily never worked alone. She had someone helping her. The realization hit Mrs. Turner like ice water. They had focused entirely on Emily. But what about those behind her? Who helped her? Who was still out there? Mrs. Turner reached for her phone. She called the police, but their response was not what she expected. We understand your concern, Mrs. Turner, but without tangible evidence, there's nothing we can investigate. Her grip tightened on the phone. You're telling me someone snuck onto my property in the middle of the night, left a threat, and you can't do anything? No fingerprints, no camera footage. If you feel unsafe, call 911 immediately. But right now, we can't open an investigation based on a single note. Mrs. Turner exhaled slowly. I understand. Her voice was cold as she hung up. Ryan was already watching her. If the police won't do anything, he said, voice steady, then I will. She opened her mouth to protest. Then she stopped, because for the first time she saw something different in Ryan. This was not a broken man. This was someone ready to fight back. She gave a single nod. Then we do this smart. Ryan nodded. Where do we start? They searched the house for anything. Documents, photos, files Emily might have left behind. But she had been too careful. Nothing. Not a single piece of paper. Not a single clue to her past. It was too perfect. Everyone had a history. School records, old addresses, friends, former jobs. But Emily? She didn't exist before she met Ryan. Ryan stared at the empty folders, his jaw clenched. She wiped everything. Mrs. Turner frowned. No one can erase themselves completely. Ryan's eyes met hers. And then, he realized, there's one place we haven't checked. The next day, Ryan and Mrs. Turner drove to New York, the city Emily had always claimed to be from. But when they arrived at the address listed on their marriage documents, they found a lie. The apartment had been vacant for over a decade. No one named Emily had ever lived there. The neighbors had never heard of her. A chill crawled up Ryan's spine. Who the hell is she? Mrs. Turner gently squeezed his shoulder. We'll find out. They spent 2 days digging, checking public records, financial institutions, school archives. Nothing. Emily had left no trail. Then, they visited an old records office. The clerk, a middle-aged man with graying hair, flipped through dusty archives. What name? Emily Hastings. Ryan's voice was tense. The man frowned, flipping a few more pages. Then, he stopped. A strange look crossed his face. Emily Hastings. Yeah. The clerk inhaled deeply. Then he slid a file onto the desk. If you're talking about Emily Hastings, his voice dropped, then you should know. She died 6 years ago. Ryan felt like the floor had disappeared beneath him. His eyes locked onto the file. Inside, a photo. A young woman. She looked exactly like Emily, but she wasn't. Because according to the records, Emily Hastings had been dead for years. Mrs. Turner's breath caught in her throat. If Emily Hastings is dead, she whispered. Ryan's hands curled into fists. Then who the hell did I marry? No one answered, because the only person who knew the truth was already gone. And somewhere, in the shadows of the city, someone else was still watching. Ryan's grip tightened around the file. His eyes locked onto the photo. The woman in the image had long brown hair, delicate features, but it was the eyes that made his breath hitch. They were Emily's. Yet what sent a chill through his spine was the line beneath the picture. Emily Hastings, date of death, 6 years ago. Beside it was a death certificate signed by a forensic pathologist in a Florida hospital. Ryan felt like the blood in his veins had turned to ice. This can't be real, he whispered. Mrs. Turner, standing beside him, scanned through the documents. Her voice wavered. Ryan, if Emily Hastings is dead, then who did you marry? Ryan inhaled sharply, forcing himself to stay calm. He turned to the records clerk. Can you tell me what happened to Emily Hastings? The man hesitated, flipping through additional pages. According to these records, she died in a car accident. Her body was identified by her only known relative, someone named Catherine Blake. Ryan's brows furrowed. Catherine Blake? Emily had never mentioned that name. Did she leave any contact information? The clerk shook his head. Number after the formalities, she disappeared. No address, no record, as if she never existed. A cold shiver ran down Ryan's spine. He turned to his mother, eyes burning with determination. "We need to find Catherine Blake." Days passed as Ryan and Mrs. Turner searched for any trace of Catherine Blake. But the name didn't exist in any government system. No driver's license, no registered address, no financial records, as if she were a ghost. But then, Ryan stumbled upon something chilling, a discussion thread on a deep web forum about unsolved cases. There, buried in an old investigative report, was a mention of a Catherine Blake, linked to a criminal network specializing in identity forgery. She wasn't just a nobody. She was tied to high-profile disappearances, large-scale fraud, and the creation of fake identities for fugitives. Mrs. Turner's hands trembled slightly as she read through the files. "Ryan," her voice barely above a whisper. She wasn't just impersonating someone. She was part of something bigger. Ryan scanned down the list of aliases connected to the organization. And then, he saw it, a name that made his blood boil. Emily Blake. Ryan's stomach dropped. "Blake," he exhaled. "That's Catherine's last name." Mrs. Turner's fingers clenched. She wasn't Emily Hastings. She was Emily Blake. Ryan let out a bitter laugh, one filled with rage. She stole a dead woman's identity and made it her own. At that moment, Ryan's phone vibrated. An unknown number. He hesitated, then answered. "Ryan," a woman's voice, cold, unshaken. "Do you miss me?" Ryan's breath caught. "Emily." His grip on the phone tightened. A soft chuckle echoed through the line. "Why are you calling me that?" Her voice was playful, taunting. "I was never Emily Hastings. And now, you know that." Ryan gritted his teeth. "Who the hell are you?" For a moment, silence. Then, a whisper. "I'm the woman you loved." His hands clenched into fists. "What do you want?" Emily let out a small laugh. "It's not about what I want, Ryan. It's about what's coming next." His jaw tightened. "Where are you?" "You don't need to know that." Her voice dropped lower. "But you should remember something, Ryan." The air grew heavier. Then her voice, colder than ever. "This game isn't over." The line went dead. Ryan stared at the phone, his heart pounding. Mrs. Turner had heard everything. She placed a firm hand on his shoulder. "She's not done." Ryan took a slow, steady breath. "No." His voice was steel. "And neither are we." That night, Ryan couldn't sleep. He sat by the window, staring out into the darkness. At his feet, Max lay still, ears twitching, eyes alert. Then, a shadow moved at the edge of the street. Ryan's muscles tensed. A figure stood under a street lamp, wearing a long coat, a hat pulled low. They weren't moving, just watching. Ryan's breath hitched. He stood, rushing to the front door. But when he stepped outside, the figure was gone. Only the wind whispered through the empty street. Then, he noticed it. A letter, lying on the front steps. Ryan picked it up, his hands cold. He opened it. Inside was a single photograph, a picture of him and his mother, taken from a distance. On the back of the photo, in scrawled handwriting, "I'm always watching." Max let out a deep, guttural growl. Ryan's eyes snapped to the street. No one. But he knew. The nightmare wasn't over. Ryan's hands shook as he gripped the photograph. There was no doubt anymore. Someone was watching them. Someone, not Emily, but working for her. He looked up at his mother, the same unease reflected in her eyes. "We need to act before it's too late." Mrs. Turner nodded. "But we don't even know where she is." Ryan's jaw clenched. "There's one person who might." He grabbed his phone, scrolling through his contacts. And then, he stopped. Ethan Calloway. Ethan Calloway was not a good person. A hacker, an information broker, a man who found things no one wanted to be found. Ryan had known him since college. Once Ethan had been a brilliant coder, until he got caught up in illegal deals. Ryan had never wanted to call him, but now, he had no other choice. He dialed. The phone rang only once before a voice answered. Ryan Turner. The voice was low, amused. Well, well, long time no see. What brings you back? Don't tell me you miss me. Ryan wasn't in the mood for jokes. I need to find someone. A pause, then a laugh. Who? An ex-girlfriend. Ryan's grip tightened. Emily Blake. This time there was no laughter. The other end of the line went silent. Then, a shift in tone. You sure? Absolutely. A slow exhale. Ryan, you're getting yourself into something you shouldn't. Ryan's voice was flat. I don't have a choice. Another pause. And then, the words that sent a chill down his spine. I can help you find her. But are you sure you want the truth? 3 days later, Ethan sent Ryan a location. A small apartment in Chicago. She was here a week ago, Ethan texted. But be careful, she's not alone. Ryan's heart pounded as he turned to his mother. We're going to Chicago. 2 days later, Ryan and Mrs. Turner stood outside a rundown complex on the outskirts of Chicago. Max sat beside Ryan, his body tense, ears alert. They entered, apartment 17. Ryan hesitated for a moment, then knocked. No answer. He exchanged a glance with his mother, then pressed the door. It wasn't locked. Ryan pushed it open. Inside, darkness. The air was thick with the stale scent of cigarettes and faint traces of perfume. Mrs. Turner stepped in first, her eyes scanning the room. A small table sat in the center. Scattered papers lay across it. Ryan stepped forward, picking one up. A list of names. Some were crossed out, some weren't. And then he saw his own name. Ryan Turner. His heartbeat thundered. Mom! His voice wavered. She turned to him. But before she could respond, the lights went out. Pitch black. Max let out a deep, guttural growl. Then, a voice echoed in the darkness. You're persistent, Ryan. Ryan's body froze. He knew that voice. Emily. She had been here. Emily! Ryan shouted, scanning the room. Nothing, just shadows. Where are you? A soft chuckle. Closer than you think. Then, a whisper of movement behind him. Ryan spun just in time, but not fast enough. A hard, cold object smashed into the back of his head. A precise hit. The world tilted. Then, darkness. A steady ticking. A distant hum. Ryan's eyes fluttered open. Pain exploded in his skull. His vision was blurry, but slowly the room came into focus. A single chair, a swinging light bulb, a cold, empty room. And then, in front of him, Emily. She sat with one leg crossed over the other, twirling a small knife in her hand. Her lips curled into a slow, knowing smile. Hello, Ryan. Ryan swallowed dryly. What do you want? Emily tilted her head. That's a good question. Her eyes glinted. But first, she leaned forward. Ryan took a deep breath, his gaze locked onto Emily. She was still as beautiful as ever, but now, that beauty was cold, dangerous. The single light bulb swung slowly overhead, casting eerie shadows on the walls. Emily tilted her head, amusement glinting in her eyes. Aren't you going to ask me? Ryan narrowed his eyes. Ask what? Emily let out a soft laugh, low, mocking. The sound echoed through the cramped room. Why I did all of this? Ryan's fists clenched as his breathing grew heavy. Who the hell are you? Emily leaned back into her chair, sighing as if she were speaking to a child. Ryan, you still don't get it, do you? She leaned forward. The question isn't who I am. Her voice dropped. It's who we're really up against. A cold shiver crawled down Ryan's spine. Emily circled him, slow and deliberate, a cat toying with a mouse. Do you really think I did all of this just for money? She shook her head. Just to control you? A smirk. No, Ryan, this isn't just some personal game. She stopped, her eyes flashing with something darker. It's part of something much, much bigger. Ryan's fist tightened. What are you talking about? Emily's lips curled, but there was no warmth in her expression. Do you know how my parents died? Ryan blinked, caught off guard by the question. Your parents? Emily nodded. They were murdered. She paused, her voice dropping lower. And the man who ordered it is someone you trust. Ryan's jaw tensed. Who? Emily stopped moving. Her gaze cut into him like a knife. Then she spoke a name that made his entire world collapse. Stephen Calloway. Ryan froze. Stephen Calloway? That was Ethan Calloway's father. The man was once a powerful businessman, known for his deep connections to the underground world. But he couldn't be involved in this. He couldn't. You're lying. Emily smiled, but there was no humor in it. I knew you'd say that. She pulled something from her coat, a folder, and tossed it onto the table. Ryan stared at the yellowed papers. Hesitation clawed at his chest as he reached for the file. And then his heart stopped. A contract. Dated June 12, 1998. Target, Richard and Elizabeth Blake. Client, Stephen Calloway. Ryan's blood turned to ice. A contract for murder. Stephen Calloway had paid for Emily's parents to be killed. His hands shook. No, this... Emily crossed her arms, her expression unreadable. Believe it or don't, Ryan. It won't change the truth. Ryan struggled to breathe. If you wanted revenge on Stephen Calloway, why come after me? Emily's eyes gleamed. Because you were the perfect pawn. Ryan felt the world tilt. You planned this from the beginning? Emily nodded. Before you even met me. Ryan's pulse pounded in his ears. Then what about Ethan? Emily laughed, a cold, haunting sound. Do you really think he helped you find me? Because he wanted to? Ryan's stomach dropped. What are you saying? Emily leaned in, voice just above a whisper. Ethan knew everything from the start. Ryan felt as if the air had been sucked out of the room. He chose my side. A sharp, piercing pain stabbed through Ryan's chest. Ethan, the man who had helped him, the man he had trusted, had betrayed him. You're lying, Emily shrugged. You'll find out soon enough. And then, boom! A gunshot. The door slammed open. A figure stepped inside. Ryan turned, and his heart stopped. Ethan Calloway. His face was blank. His hand held a gun, and he was pointing it at Ryan. Ryan's breath hitched. Ethan! Bang! A searing pain tore through Ryan's shoulder. He crashed to the ground, blood soaking his shirt. Emily smirked as she watched him struggle. Right on time. Ethan lowered his gun, stuffing it back into his belt. He barely spared Ryan a glance. I'm just here to make sure he doesn't ruin the plan. Ryan groaned, his vision blurring. Emily knelt beside him, her voice like ice. The game's not over, Ryan. She stood, glancing at Ethan. They walked toward the door. Ryan tried to move, tried to force his body up, but the darkness was already pulling him under. The last thing he heard was Emily's voice, soft as a whisper. Remember, I'll always be watching. Ryan's eyes snapped open. The world around him blurred, like a shattered painting struggling to piece itself back together. A sharp, burning pain in his shoulder sent a wave of nausea through his body. The stench of blood filled the air. His throat was dry, his mind foggy. Where am I? A dim light seeped through the cracks of the door, casting eerie shadows on cold concrete walls. Ryan tried to move, but his legs were bound to the chair, his hands tied, his chest tightened. He was trapped, and judging by the silence, there was no way out. Then, footsteps, slow, purposeful. A deep voice rumbled from the other side of the door. He's still breathing? Ryan's breath hitched. He knew that voice. Ethan. A soft chuckle followed. Let him stay that way for now. I want him to see it all before we finish this. Emily. Ryan's hands clenched into fists. See what? The door swung open. Emily walked in first, Ethan right behind her. She was as flawless as ever. But there was no more pretense, no more warmth, only ruthlessness. Do you know why you're still alive, Ryan? Ryan's jaw tightened. He said nothing. Emily smiled. Because you're still useful. Ethan leaned against the wall, arms crossed, eyes filled with mocking amusement. You really thought we just wanted you dead, he scoffed. No, Ryan, death is too easy. Emily stepped closer, lowering herself to his eye level. We want you alive long enough to watch your world burn. A cold shiver ran down Ryan's spine. Emily threw a thick folder onto the table. Ryan glanced down, and his heart stopped. It was his family's financial records, bank statements, loan agreements, assets, and then fraudulent documents, fake debts, forged transactions, all leading to one conclusion. Ryan Turner was now a criminal. His breath turned shallow. Emily's voice was silk and steel. "You think I just take money? No, Ryan, I take lives." She leaned in, whispering against his ear. "And now on paper, you're nothing more than a con man, a thief. The police will never believe you. They planned this. Everything. From the beginning." But Ryan wasn't done yet. He took a slow breath. The ropes around his wrists loose. They'd underestimated him. They thought they had won. And that was their first mistake. Ryan met Emily's gaze. "You think I'll just roll over and accept this?" Ethan laughed. "What other choice do you have?" Ryan's fingers curled around the loosened knot. "Just a little more." Emily turned to Ethan. "Take him. We finish this tonight." Ethan pushed off the wall, walking toward Ryan. Now Ryan ripped his hands free in one swift motion. Before Ethan could react, crack! Ryan slammed his forehead straight into Ethan's nose. Blood splattered. Ethan stumbled back, cursing. Emily stepped back in shock. Ryan lunged forward, his fingers snatching the gun off the table. Click. He pulled the trigger. Bang! The bullet whizzed past Emily's shoulder, shattering the wall behind her. She stumbled back, her heels slipping on the concrete floor. Ryan spun toward the door and ran. The hallway was narrow, dark. Ryan pushed forward, ignoring the throbbing pain in his shoulder. He had to get out. Behind him, Emily's voice echoed through the space. "Don't let him escape. Not today. Not like this." Ryan burst through the exit into a cold, empty alleyway. He didn't stop. Footsteps thundered behind him, but Ryan ran faster. Blood soaked his shirt. His vision blurred, but he pushed on. They thought they had set the rules, that they had already won. But they made one mistake. Ryan Turner wasn't easy to break. If they wanted a final game, he would play to the very end. Ryan sprinted through the dark alley, his breath sharp, heart pounding like a war drum. The cold night air cut into his skin, but the pain in his shoulder wound was nothing compared to the fear gripping his chest. Behind him, footsteps thundered closer. Emily, Ethan, they wouldn't stop. They had set the rules for this game. They couldn't let Ryan escape and expose everything. But Ryan wasn't easy prey. He wouldn't die here. Not when the truth still remained buried. Not when his family was still in danger. He turned sharply at an intersection, stumbling but catching himself. And then, he made a choice. He had to fight back. Ryan dashed across the road, slipping into an abandoned industrial zone. With shaking fingers, he dialed a number. The phone rang. Once. Twice. Then, Ryan? Frank Pearson, a federal agent, someone Ryan had known from his time in financial crime investigations. "Frank, listen," Ryan gasped. "I have proof of a massive fraud operation, but I need you here. Now." A pause. Then, Frank's voice tightened. "Where are you?" Ryan parted his lips to answer. Bang! A bullet struck the wall beside him. Ryan dove behind a shipping container, clutching his phone. Emily had caught up. "Ryan!" Frank's voice was urgent. "They found me. I'm sending my location. Get here fast." Ryan's fingers raced over the screen. Frank didn't hesitate. "I'm on my way." Ryan ended the call, heart hammering. If he could just hold out until Frank arrived, it would all be over. Footsteps echoed. Ryan held his breath. Emily's silhouette flickered beneath the dim streetlights. "Do you really think you can run forever, Ryan?" Her voice was smooth, chilling. "This is my game, not yours." Ryan's fingers curled around his gun. "You forgot something, Emily." She paused. "What?" Ryan leaped from cover. Bang! His fist collided with Emily's face. She staggered, eyes wide in shock. Ryan didn't hesitate. He twisted, delivering a sharp kick to her stomach. Emily hit the ground, coughing. "You forgot that I can play too." But a sharp impact struck the back of his head. Ryan's vision spun. Ethan stood there, his gun raised. You really thought you won? Ethan sneered. Ryan collapsed to his knees. No, not like this. Not when he was so close. Ethan cocked the gun. Ryan braced himself. And then, a thunderous snarl shattered the night. Emily and Ethan whipped around. Then, a shadow lunged forward. Bam! Ethan screamed as jaws clamped down on his arm. Max, Ryan's loyal companion. The dog snapped and growled, dragging Ethan to the ground. The gun skidded across the pavement. Emily scrambled back, eyes wild. She reached for her knife. Blaring sirens filled the air. Red and blue flashed across the alley. Frank had arrived, and with him, an entire SWAT team. Emily was pinned to the ground, handcuffed. Ethan, bleeding, was surrounded by armed officers. Ryan pushed himself up, dazed but victorious. He met Emily's gaze, and this time, there was no smile, no cocky amusement, only emptiness. Ryan turned to Frank. I have evidence. Everything in my phone. Fraud, manipulation, money laundering, murder. Frank nodded. We'll handle the rest. Ryan exhaled deeply. It was over. He crouched beside Max, stroking his fur. You saved me, buddy, Max whined, pressing into Ryan's hand. For the first time in months, Ryan felt free. Evil doesn't always come with a twisted face. It comes with a smile, with a gentle touch, with words that make you trust. But instincts never lie. If Ryan had ignored the warning signs, if Max had stopped barking, he wouldn't have survived. This wasn't just a story about deception. It was about resilience, loyalty, and trusting yourself. When darkness surrounds you, don't give in. Fight. Keep moving, because the truth always wins. Have you ever ignored your instincts and later regretted it? Tell us in the comments below. If you found this story gripping, hit like and comment. Don't forget to share so others can learn this lesson too. And remember, subscribe to Hidden Stories now for more thrilling stories.